making the upper cabinets that go in above the bed inside the van. So what we've done is made a template that we started out with, and I made some rough cuts on the saw using the miter stop in order to get close. And once I was close, I then took measurements at different points. So one at the end and one right here that went to the joints in the van where we framed up the roof. And from there, I made a more accurate template, which is this template. And what I'm doing now is working on getting the miter cuts perfectly on the line that I have scribed. This one's pretty close, but getting the miter stop just right, I've been taking off really small pieces of wood at a time. So basically I started off with that, and then shave this piece off of there, and we'll do, now that I've got the miter dialed in pretty close, we're going to do the final cut on this one. And then once we're done with this, we'll take it and use it as the master for all of the upper cabinet ends that go towards the back of the van above the bed.
Alright, so if you're more interested on how this process works, we're going to break it down using some of the slow-mo footage here and go a little more in depth on the steps that we took and why we did what we did and the tools we used and basically everything in between all that. So we finished up the miter cuts like I was talking about earlier, and then now what we're doing is getting ready to rough cut all of our pieces of lumber to make the sides of the cabinet cases. So we're using a cabinet grade 3/4 birch ply for all of our cabinet cases, and basically got the table saw set here, running the lumber through, making the end pieces the right lengths and the bottom pieces. So these are just the outer sides of the case. One thing to note, you can see I've got my saw blade set a good bit higher than the lumber that I'm cutting. The reason I'm doing that is to help prevent chip out on the veneer as much as possible. Another thing that you can do is make a zero clearance saw blade insert that will prevent chip out on the bottom side, because what happens is as the blade goes through the material, the teeth are pulling downwards as it comes out of the material, and that's what causes the veneer to chip out and basically shoot down into the bottom of the saw basically. And that's just something most people might not worry about it. I'm a little particular, kind of like for things to look clean and precise when they're coming out of the saw. The other thing you'll notice, I'm running a Diablo blade, a fine cut blade to help with keeping that finish nice and smooth as well. So basically we're doing the upper cabinets here, so those are going above the beds on the bed on each side. So basically it's just a mirror image for each of them. So there's 4 cabinet ends and 4 cabinet supports that will go inside the case of the cabinet. And we're getting all those squared up. On the first go round in my plans, I hadn't really thought it through enough to get all the angles right, and that's something I wish I had taken more time and went ahead and made a model in SketchUp, which is what I did for the later cabinets, and of course for the face frames when I did those. And that made that process go so much smoother. There's definitely something to be said for a good hand-drawn sketch, but the problem you run into there is your hand-drawn sketch requires you to do all the calculations and determine all of the angles and figure all of that out mathematically, which honestly I was too lazy to do and figured I would just figure it out as I went, and that made it where the first set of cabinet cases that I made, they didn't really go together quite as perfectly as I wanted them to. The cabinet backs didn't really fit. I ended up having to put extra pieces of lumber in, which we're going to get into later, in order to make those fit. And all in all, I wish I had just went ahead and made the SketchUp model and done it differently from the beginning and not had to go through all that trouble. It would have saved me a ton of time, and definitely on the next van that I do, if I ever do another one, I will most certainly do that. So here we're cutting the long pieces for the cabinet tops and the cabinet bottom, and we're going to get those cut down to size. And the way that we're going to join these all together is using rabbets and dados and grooves. And this is kind of it was probably overkill in all honesty on these cabinets. I probably could have pocket holed them together and put plugs in and been perfectly fine, which is what I ended up doing on some of the other cabinets when I was getting in the groove of things and figuring out kind of how things went together with the cabinets. But the one good thing about the upper cabinets that are using the rabbets and dados and grooves is it's a really kind of a high-end joinery technique, and it should never come apart. Basically, it increases the glue joint surface area exponentially and gives you a really strong bond. The main reason that I chose to do this type of joinery to begin with is that it makes it where you don't have any nail holes or screw holes that you have to fill later on. Everything comes out as a nice clean seam, and it's just a glue joint that you sand down and paint, and it's very clean and a lot less work on that end. But one thing that you'll find is, one, if you don't have a good router, and two, if you don't have a really consistent setup, you'll have rabbets and grooves and dados that don't exactly line up, and then it just results in a lot more sanding than it's probably worth to begin with. So that's one thing. I invested in a nice Bosch router and set router and plunge router kit, and that's one thing. I used the set table much more than I should have. I should have been using the plunge router for most of this, and then even another step further, if I had went ahead and gotten a router table, this would have gone exponentially faster because you can set the fence and just roll through things without having to make little guides and getting the bit set perfectly every time and all that hoopla there, which I'll show you a little bit later on how I made those guides. Fortunately, I do have a rabbet cutting bit, which has a roller bearing on the bottom, and it makes cutting the rabbets really, really quick. You just set the depth and you can roll through those. I'll put a link in the description to the Frood bits that I use in my router. I found that those are high quality bits. I got them at my local tool supply store, but you can also order them on Amazon as well. So I'll put those links below. So now what we're doing is we're taking the rough cut ends and cutting them down to size with the correct angles that we found from our template. So basically I'm starting with a rectangular piece of lumber, and I'm going to end up with a perfect set of matched ends. And the way that I'm cutting this is with a top roller router bit. Looking back, I probably should have done smaller passes. I was trying to take way too much material out in each pass. One reason is because the top roller bit was very long, and so I had to at least take out a half an inch in the first pass, which on a 1/4 inch shank router bit, which is what I'm running, is way too much material. You probably only want to take out at maximum a 1/4 inch of depth in each pass, so you don't put too much side loading on your router bit and cause it to dull quicker. So that's something I learned as I was going, and if I did it again, I would probably just use the miter saw to get the angles cut in the boards, and it would have ended up close enough that it wouldn't have mattered. But I didn't end up with a perfectly identical set of ends for the cabinets, which did help when I was assembling. Everything was very square. I don't think I was more than a 32nd or a 16th out of square on any of my cabinet cases, which made making the face frames and things of that nature a little bit easier later on in the build. So now that I've got those pieces cut down, I went ahead and put my rabbets and dados on those, and now we're going to get the dados cut in the bottom piece and get ready to dry fit everything and get the measurements to make our inserts in the middle fit properly within the center of the cabinets there. And how those are going to go in is basically I cut a dado on the top and the bottom, and those center pieces just slide in. And that's another cabinet making technique that some people use, some people don't. More than likely, I probably could have just screwed those in and puttied over the screw holes, and it would have come out just as clean and been 500 times faster than the way I did it. So the step of dry fitting everything that we're about to get to here, this is one of those steps where if I would have just went ahead and put in the time ahead of time and made a nice model and done it in SketchUp, I could have avoided all this, a lot less thinking and figuring on the fly and messing with the end pieces and measuring and then messing them up and having to cut them again and things like that. If I just would have went ahead and made a model, I would have just cut everything out and basically put it all together right away and not had to go through all the measuring and figuring and all that kind of deal that I'm going through here, which sped up, it doesn't look like much time, but when you do this on every piece of cabinetry that you do, you end up wasting a lot of time that you could have just saved on the front end. So definitely a lesson that I learned. But getting back to the dados that we're about to cut, I've got two 90-degree clamp-on blocks that I made out of some extra scrap plywood. And basically what you can do is you can take the piece that you want to sandwich inside the dado groove and clamp it between the two 90-degree blocks and use a top bearing router bit and set it at the depth at which you want to cut the dado, and it will basically ride on the sides of the 90-degree blocks and cut a perfectly sized dado to fit the piece that you're trying to get to slide in there. And I was actually pretty happy with this method. I got very, very tight joints, and that definitely made it easier when gluing everything together and keeping everything square. You just kind of pop it in with a hammer, and everything goes really smoothly and really quick. So we use this method to cut the dados on the top and the bottom of the cabinets, and basically did them at the same time to make sure that they fit perfectly and aligned up the way we wanted to. So we had to do a little bit of measuring, clamp it on there, cut the grooves or the dados, and then finally we were able to put everything together and make sure that it was what we wanted. So then it was time to glue everything together. And this is where having an assembly table like I've made here really comes in handy. It would have actually been nice to have one that was slightly larger in order to get the entire cabinet face on it. As you can see, it's made out of 2 sheets of MDF plywood with a 1/4-inch ply piece on top, just as like a sacrificial piece that if glue gets on it and everything, it doesn't matter. And the reason that it's made the way that it is to make sure I have a perfectly flat surface in order to assemble things on. And this makes a huge difference when you're trying to do cabinets like this and you want the front face to be perfectly flat, so when you put the face frame on, everything lines up like you want. So used 2 screws on the top on each divider in the middle, just to give it a little more structural strength, because there's really not much holding the cabinets on the bottom other than a piece of trim that's going to go under them to support that. So really they're screwed into the rafters of the van, and then the cabinet backs are screwed into the wall, but those are not really structurally sound as much so as the top. So really wanted those top joints to be extra strong. So now we're getting into the part where I had to go in and add some supports like I was talking about earlier, because I didn't really think enough ahead to make the cabinets the way that I should have. And so basically I just cut stretchers to go in between the back pieces, and these stretchers will be able to be screwed into the metal on the side of the van because of the way that we framed our van out. We didn't fur out everywhere because we wanted to try to conserve every little bit of space that we could. So if you want to check out our video on how we frame the van, that'll go a little bit more in depth to that and show you kind of how to maximize the space you have in a Sprinter van, because to be honest, space is pretty precious and we really didn't want to waste any. So we're basically putting the stretchers in here using some wood glue and some Kreg holes. I've come to really fall in love with the Kreg jig, and I use it almost more than any tool in the shop now. You can pretty much put together anything you need to with Kreg holes, and most of the time you can hide them where you don't even see them. And just like these, they're going to be up against the metal on the van on the back side of the cabinet, so you won't even know they're there. And so the other purpose of these is to give us something to mount the cabinet back to. Because on these, I made the 2 inside pieces slightly smaller than the outside pieces, thinking that the cabinet back would fit flush against the basically the base and the top plate, but it didn't really work because it left gaps and it kind of just didn't look like I wanted it to. So that's what I was talking about earlier, where I learned some lessons, and here's where I cut the extra little pieces that had to go in the tops of the cabinets. And I mean, from the outside, obviously you can't see it, and it doesn't really make any difference. But when you open the cabinets, you can see that, oh, this was an afterthought to put the cabinet back on, and it kind of just, it's not exactly how I wanted it to be. If I wasn't on a time schedule and on a budget, I probably would have thrown those cabinets away and made them how I made the second set of cabinets, which we're going to get to here later in the video, and you'll see the improvements that I made on the second set in order to basically be happy with the construction of them. So here we're starting to cut out the cabinet backs. We used 1/4-inch birch ply for this. Really, there's not much structural integrity that's involved in the cabinet backs, so they can be as thin as you want to make them. 1/4-inch is pretty standard for cabinet backs. And a lot of people too don't use 3/4 all the way around on their cabinets. Sometimes you'll use half for the bottoms and 3/4 for the sides, and you could probably, if you wanted to, get away with 1/2 inch everywhere. But we really wanted to have a sturdy cabinet system, and I didn't want to have to hang it with 500,000 screws. Really, there's only a couple screws put into the cabinets to hold them in because they are so strong. Another thing that you saw me doing is I used my assembly table as an outfeed table for the table saw. I made it to where it's the exact height to help with bigger sheet goods, because a full 4x8 sheet of plywood is a bear to manage going through a job site table saw. Now, if I had a full wood shop and a table saw with a bigger table, obviously that would help. And I know that because when I went to my friend Justin's shop, who is the owner of Diverse Designs, which you'll see later in this video, he has one of those table saws that's really nice to use, and it makes things a lot easier. So when we're installing our cabinet backs, basically we went with a glue and staple method. So I've got a pneumatic staple gun. It's a relatively cheap staple gun. It's like 30 bucks. We'll put a link to the description below. If you have an air compressor, I would highly recommend this gun. It's super fast, super easy to use, and it has saved us a lot of time on our van build, being able to staple things together really quickly. Having two people for this is really helpful because I was trying to get the glue spread out, and it was really hot and humid in the shop, so the glue was setting up really fast and basically drying way quicker than I could work with it. So it was imperative to get the panels on and stapled as quick as we could so that the glue joints would be strong. And this is something, really, I probably put about 4 times as many staples as I need to in the cabinet backs, but it did make a pretty good difference in the strength and rigidity of the cabinets. So as you can see, we're going with a black color scheme for our cabinets. We puttied and filled the sides to basically smooth over all the seams, and now we are sanding the insides of them and blowing them out, and we put 2 coats of polyurethane on the inside, mainly just to seal the wood, and it does give it a nice clean looking finish. So now we're going to get into the second set of cabinets that we made and see all the improvements.
For round 2 of the upper cabinets, we decided to take a slightly different approach in how we put the pieces together. So one thing that I did, instead of cutting off the piece of lumber at the top straight, is I put a nice angle down it to match the contour of the cabinet. This will make attaching the cabinet backs much easier. I also did a very similar thing at the bottom. Before, it was just a straight edge that would have come up like this, and so this time I matched the angle on the bottom piece to here, so when we attach the cabinet back, it will mount flush to the back of the frame. This will make it where we don't have any of those awkward gaps in our cabinet backs. And this is also important on this piece because the right side of it here, right in front of the camera, this will be open, so you'll be able to see the cabinet backs all of the time. So now what we've got left to do is to put our middle supports in here, and what we're going to do for those is cut 2 dado grooves along the center, or actually spaced out evenly in the cabinet, to where it will be 3 even openings once the supports are put in.
To finish up all the work on the upper cabinets, I went down to my friend's shop in 96, South Carolina. Justin Holliday, he's the owner of Diverse Designs. If you're looking for a van conversion or any fine woodworking or metalworking, he's one of the most detail-oriented people that I know, and you'll definitely be happy with the end product. So here we're building the cabinet that goes above our kitchen, and it's just a 2-section cabinet. You were using a similar construction method that we used on all the rest of the cabinets with dados and grooves, and basically now we're running the router and cutting out the grooves that the pieces will go into. And one thing about the cabinet that goes above the kitchen is it has some weird contours in it because it goes right next to the sliding door, and so the metal that holds the door frame is basically sticks out away from the wall, and so we had to take a lot of time and make a template and figure out exactly where we needed to cut the cabinet, and we actually cut a big chunk out of the rear right corner of it to where it fits around the metal for the door opening. And that's why anything you do in a van is going to take exponentially longer than anything you do in a house, because everything is custom. And one thing that I did on this one is I accidentally cut the rabbet or the dado groove in the middle in the wrong place. So we had to fix that. And that's why you saw us scrambling around a minute ago. So now we've got the cabinet all clamped up and we're waiting for it to dry. And then we'll throw a cabinet back on it and it'll be ready to mount. And that pretty much does it for our upper cabinets. So if you like what you saw, make sure you hit that thumbs up button. If you're interested to see more of how we did stuff on our van, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn your notifications on. We're back going now with about a video a week, so we're going to try to keep that pace until we get to the end of our build. Right now the van's pretty much done, so from here on out it's just editing videos and making sure that you guys get the content that you want. So make sure you leave some comments below if you have any questions. We'll definitely get back to you. Hit that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week for more. Thanks for watching.